The morning fog lay heavy over Little Wrenley, curling like lazy serpents around the gables and garden walls, and Lord Peter Wimsey, by no particularly noble accident, found himself alighting from a taxi with the air of a man who had already solved the day's conundrums, though, as he well knew, this was rarely the case. He had come, ostensibly, to inspect a recently purchased estate map at the behest of the Honourable Geraldine Mordaunt, a lady whose taste in both linen and litigation seemed equal parts exquisite and perilously fastidious. But as Wimsey noted, the distinction between an ordinary errand and the inception of murder is often a matter of ink and paper, as any competent detective or pedantic bibliophile will attest, is rarely innocent. The hall of Little Wrenley House smelt faintly of wet wood polish and over-earnest civility. Servants bustled with mechanical precision, eyes cast downward as though the very sight of a titled man might compromise their delicate constitution. Wimsey's attention, however, was immediately captured by the object in question, a hand-drawn map of the estate, its lines smudged and annotations smeared, as though the cartographer had been both hurried and nervous. A few fingerprints, some human, some unplaceable, adorned the margins. Curious, Wimsey murmured, tapping the map with a pink-gloved finger. The river should flow east, not north. I dare say this map is already lying to us. Miss Mordaunt, standing behind a prim mahogany desk, gave him a look that suggested she was simultaneously scandalized and intrigued. Lord Peter, you amuse yourself with trifles, but this is urgent. I found it in my late uncle's study, after he passed last night, quite unexpectedly. I fear someone might have—" she faltered. "Someone might have murdered him," Wimsey supplied, in that tone of dry incredulity that suggested the very notion was both horrifying and delightfully stimulating. Miss Mordaunt shivered, though whether from fear or the draught seeping beneath the door it was impossible to tell. I cannot imagine. Yet the study, it was disturbed. Papers scattered, a cup of ink overturned upon this map, as if someone wished to erase the truth. "Ah," said Wimsey, adjusting his monocle with the elegance of a man who considered ocular accessories a matter of philosophy rather than necessity. "Ink, the most obedient of media until it becomes unruly. And fingerprints, you say? Unfamiliar ones?" "Yes," she whispered. "I cannot recognize them, though the house has few visitors. And yet—" Her voice trailed off, leaving a suggestion of dread that seemed to curl around the corners of the room. Wimsey crouched, examining the smudges, his expression one of amused speculation. The map is a liar, the ink a conspirator, and the fingerprints— well, we shall see whether they are accomplices or mere innocents in the drama of yesterday. Miss Mordaunt, I hope you have retained everything exactly as you found it." "Everything, Lord Peter." Her voice trembled with exactitude. "I've disturbed nothing, not the papers, not the furniture, not even the penknife." "Excellent," Wimsey said, rising with a faint flourish. "Then we have the first of our little puzzle's pieces, and pray, do you know if your late uncle had enemies or debts?" Miss Mordaunt hesitated, biting the inside of her cheek. He was a man of peculiar associations. Letters came occasionally of an insistent and rather menacing tone, but nothing I imagined could lead to violence. Wimsey smiled faintly, as if he already suspected otherwise. "Ah, my dear Miss Mordaunt, in my experience, the ordinary mind is rarely prepared for the extraordinary crime. But the extraordinary crime, I assure you, often begins with something ordinary. Ink, fingerprints, maps, trifles, very trifles indeed." He glanced once more at the map, tracing the smudged river with the tip of his gloved finger. The fog outside seemed to press against the window, thick and expectant, as if it, too, were awaiting the revelation of what little humans call justice. And in that moment, as a servant entered with the breakfast tray clattering politely, Lord Peter Wimsey felt the familiar stirrings of anticipation. The game, he knew, had begun. Lord Peter Wimsey spent a moment inhaling the faint aroma of damp wood polish mingled with the lingering tang of ink, his eyes glancing once more at the smudged map before turning toward the corners of the study, where shadows pooled like small conspiracies. "Miss Mordaunt," he began, his voice light yet pointed, "the first thing one must ascertain is not the manner of a man's death, nor the potential perpetrator, but the theatre in which the scene was set, and that requires witnesses, however reluctant." Miss Mordaunt inclined her head with delicate acquiescence. "The servants, Lord Peter. They know nothing truly. My housekeeper, Mrs. Galloway, insists she saw nothing last night but the weather changing. The footman, Thomas, is convinced he heard only the wind against the eaves." "Ah," said Wimsey, tapping his chin thoughtfully. "Wind, the most generous of accomplices. And yet, in my experience, servants are seldom entirely truthful, not out of malice, but habit. Their silence is a language unto itself, and I find it most illuminating." He straightened, his eyes scanning the faintly ornate woodwork, the glint of brass handles, the quiet symmetry of the room. "We shall begin with Mrs. Galloway, then, and Thomas, and any other loyal observers of nocturnal activities. Sometimes the smallest remark, the tiniest gesture, betrays more than the entire confession of a distraught gentleman." The housekeeper arrived promptly, her appearance neat, but her hands knotted with anxiety. I assure you, Lord Peter, I disturbed nothing. I locked the side doors at 11, checked the windows twice. The master, God rest him, was last seen in the study at 10:30, and after that I retired to my quarters." Wimsey's gaze was not unkind, though it carried that particular weight of scrutiny that suggested an invisible magnifying glass hovering over every syllable. "And the bell, Mrs. Galloway? Did it ring during the night?" The housekeeper hesitated. "No, my lord, though Thomas, the footman, may have heard something, a scratching perhaps, near the library door. I paid it no mind, thought it the wind or a mouse." "Indeed," murmured Wimsey. "The difference between a mouse and a murderer, in terms of noise, can be merely a matter of perspective. And Thomas? Where is the footman?" Thomas appeared, tall, slightly gangly, and with a nervous eagerness that suggested an instinct for self-preservation at odds with his desire to impress. I heard a thump in the study around 11. Thought it a book falling. I did not enter. I assumed Mr. Mordaunt was arranging his papers." Wimsey arched an eyebrow. "At 11, you say?" He traced a finger along the map, now smudged and ominous under the study lamp. "Yet Mrs. Galloway insists the master was seen at 10:30. A window of 30 minutes, small, yet in a house of this size, enough for a mouse, a visitor, or perhaps a hand eager to rearrange the fates of men." Thomas swallowed. I suppose so, my lord. I did not think it important. Sir, I only followed orders." "Precisely why it is important," Wimsey replied with a quiet, arch amusement. "Orders and obedience, truly the backbone of any well-constructed alibi." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room as if it might confess in lieu of a human witness. "And tell me, Thomas, did you note anything unusual about the map? Any marks, smudges, fingerprints?" The boy blinked. "Well, yes, my lord. There was a smear of ink, and I thought I saw what might have been a handprint, but—" He hesitated, eyes flicking to Mrs. Galloway, who gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of her head. "I did not dare touch it." "Wise," said Wimsey. "Ink is treacherous, fingerprints more so. One must handle them with caution, and curiosity in equal measure. Curiosity, Thomas, is the prelude to revelation." He rose, giving the pair a faint arch smile. "Now I shall wish to see the study as it was found, untouched, as you say, and perhaps wander the corridors myself. A house is a book, and every corridor, every panel, every lock and latch is a sentence. Only by reading them can we discern the story the walls have witnessed." As he moved toward the study, Wimsey's eyes lingered on the corners of the walls, on the unevenness of the floorboards, on a faint shadow beneath the desk. Even the smallest irregularity, the slight tilt of a picture frame, the half-closed drawer, told him far more than the servant's words. The house, he mused, was already whispering secrets, though the occupants insisted on silence. Little Wrenley, in its polished civility, was beginning to unravel, thread by careful thread, and Lord Peter Wimsey, ever the gentleman detective, was intent on seeing just how knotted the tapestry of truth had become. Wimsey moved through the study with the deliberate ease of a man surveying a landscape for hidden fortresses. His eyes flicked from the spattered blot of ink on the desk to the scattered papers, noting the careful disorder as though it had been arranged by a mind both nervous and precise. He crouched beside a fallen sheet, fingertips hovering above the damp edge, and murmured, "A hurried hand, perhaps, but not clumsy. Someone accustomed to writing yet disturbed enough to falter." Miss Mordaunt followed at a discreet distance, her expression a mixture of apprehension and admiration. "Do you think it could have been my uncle's own hand, Lord Peter?" she asked. "Possible," he replied, eyes narrowed, "but less interesting and therefore less likely. The truly compelling culprit leaves traces of another presence, even while seeming to obey the ordinary." He straightened and pointed toward the fireplace, where a letter lay half hidden behind a fire screen. And letters, my dear Miss Mordaunt, are seldom as innocuous as they appear. She stepped forward, curiosity piqued despite herself. "It is addressed to my uncle, but the handwriting is strange. I cannot read the signature." Wimsey lifted the letter with gloved fingers, scanning the lines swiftly. "The phrasing is peculiar. A request, or rather an insistence, cloaked in civility. Observe the repetition. Your attention, your care, your discretion. 3 identical imperatives, each underlined with the faintest pressure. Anxiety disguised as etiquette. Someone wished to command, but politely." He replaced the letter and moved to the desk, peering at the ink blotches again. "Notice how the smears run. Vertical, suggesting a rapid motion from top to bottom. Yet the paper was horizontal on the desk. The writer was left-handed, or so I suspect, but the final flourish betrays a right-handed hand attempting imitation." Miss Mordaunt gasped softly. "Do you mean someone was pretending to write?" "Exactly so," said Wimsey, with a faint smile that did not reach the calculating eyes. "A deception in handwriting is often a confession in disguise. Now, we must consider who among those with access could execute such a subtle ruse." He turned toward the window, the morning light streaming through half-drawn curtains, casting narrow, rigid beams across the polished floor. "And then there is the matter of time. The study was discovered at 8 this morning, yet the last confirmed sighting of your uncle was 10:30 the previous evening. We have a narrow window of opportunity, roughly 9.5 hours unaccounted for. Every movement within that interval is suspect." "Could the servants have noticed something?" Miss Mordaunt asked. Wimsey shook his head. "They may have noticed, but not recognized. The house, as it often does, shields its secrets behind the familiar routines. One observes only what one expects. A footstep in a corridor, a door closing, commonplace. Yet a single, unremarkable sound can signify a great disruption if one knows what to listen for." He paused at the doorway, his gaze sweeping the room once more, catching the glint of a brass handle on the far side. "Tell me, Miss Mordaunt, were any visitors expected last night?" "None, my lord," she replied firmly. "Only my uncle, the servants, and myself." Wimsey's lips curved in a faint arch smile. "Excellent. A perfect storm of solitude and secrecy, ideal conditions for a visitor with a purpose and a plan. And yet, not a single soul can be accounted for during that critical interval. Curious, is it not, how the absence of evidence is often the loudest testimony of all?" He moved toward the map again, the smudges now appearing almost theatrical under his scrutiny. "And here," he said, tapping the paper lightly, We have another clue of deceptive simplicity. The river does not run where it ought. A small alteration, perhaps, a misdirection designed to occupy the casual observer, while something more consequential occurs elsewhere. Whoever handled this map wished to draw attention away from something. Miss Mordaunt frowned. Something. Like what, Lord Peter? Wimsey did not answer immediately. Instead, he rose and crossed to the door, his expression that of a man who had already begun to assemble the first threads of a complex web. Patience, my dear. The first step is to observe the patterns in the ordinary, the servants' habits, the doors left unlocked, the clocks that mark time inaccurately. The truth often hides in the trivial, and it is precisely these trifles that lead to the discovery of the extraordinary. As he spoke, a faint creaking sound came from the corridor outside, a subtle shift of floorboards as though someone had just passed unnoticed. Wimsey's eyes flicked toward the door, his gaze narrowing ever so slightly. And there, he murmured, is the reminder that, even in the quietest of houses, one is never truly alone. He turned back to the study, examining the scattered papers, the ink blots, the map, and the letter. Each seemed insignificant in isolation, yet collectively they formed a silent narrative, waiting for the right mind to interpret it. We shall start with observation and small, careful inquiries, he said, voice steady and calm, and gradually the gaps in time and evidence will begin to fill themselves. And when they do, my dear Miss Mordaunt, we may discover that the simplest assumptions conceal the most troubling truths. The servants exchanged nervous glances, while Miss Mordaunt seemed to shiver in anticipation. And Lord Peter Wimsey, standing amid the study's faintly oppressive stillness, allowed himself the faintest smirk. The game had deepened. The puzzle, intricate and frustratingly elegant, was beginning to take shape. Wimsey spent the next hour tracing the faint irregularities of the house with the methodical patience of a man inspecting an ancient manuscript for hidden annotations. He moved from room to room, noting the subtle variations in carpet wear, the uneven polish of door handles, the faint impressions in the dust upon a windowsill, all details that most would dismiss, but each of which, in his mind, hinted at a story unspoken. Returning to the study, he bent over the map once more. The smudges now seemed less accidental and more deliberate, almost as if the paper had been pressed and prodded with intent. He tapped a corner lightly with a gloved finger. Here, for instance, the smear is too consistent for a mere spill. It suggests hesitation, then correction, then urgency. Whoever handled this map wanted to convey confusion without admitting purpose. Miss Mordaunt, who had lingered at the threshold, watched him with an expression oscillating between admiration and trepidation. "Do you think someone deliberately altered the map, Lord Peter?" "Undoubtedly," he replied, without a trace of impatience. "But the alteration is secondary. The primary clue is timing. A left-hand smear disguised by a right-handed flourish, occurring between 10:30 and the discovery at 8 a.m. We must consider who could have had access and motive in that precise window." He rose, glancing toward the fireplace again. The letter that had seemed so unremarkable now took on a new significance. "And these letters," he murmured. "The language is formal, almost ceremonious, but see how certain words are underlined. A subtle insistence upon discretion. Anxiety disguised as courtesy, my dear Miss Mordaunt. Anxiety indeed often heralds action." He moved to the desk drawers, opening each with the faintest creak. Inside, he noted an assortment of papers, financial accounts, legal documents, and a small notebook, its pages filled with meticulous handwriting. One page caught his eye, a series of numbers, dates, and initials, arranged in a seemingly random pattern. Wimsey's fingers hovered over the page. Codes, perhaps, or merely a personal accounting. But nothing here is accidental. The hand that wrote it was deliberate, organized, cautious. We may find a pattern that corresponds to the movements last night. Miss Mordaunt shifted uneasily. You think it might explain the disturbance in the study? Possibly, or it may merely illuminate character. Character often dictates opportunity, and opportunity, my dear, dictates action. We shall see which is which. He stood and moved toward the window, studying the garden beyond, where the morning mist still clung stubbornly to the hedgerows. "Observe," he said, pointing, "the paths. Narrow, winding, but with no obvious shortcuts. A visitor intending mischief would have been seen by any alert servant or neighbor. Yet Thomas heard a thump at 11, unexplained. Mrs. Galloway recalls nothing. The window locks are secure, the doors bolted. Someone entered and left without detection, or the disruption occurred entirely within the study." He turned back to the room, expression arch and amused. "And that, Miss Mordaunt, is the true delight of a house such as this. It appears orderly, civil, impenetrable. Yet beneath the veneer of politeness, it hums with the quiet rhythms of intrigue." Wimsey tapped the map again, tracing the misaligned river with a delicate fingertip. "Consider this," he said. "The river runs incorrectly, the ink smudged deliberately, fingerprints partially obscured. The simplest explanation, a hurried hand, cannot account for the precision of error, the choice of distraction. The perpetrator has skill, foresight, and a knowledge of human observation." Miss Mordaunt shivered, though she did not know whether from cold or the implication of his words. "You think my uncle was targeted, Lord Peter?" "Most assuredly," he replied, voice calm but firm. "But not merely for what he possessed or for some petty quarrel. The aim was more subtle, to manipulate, to control, to conceal. And the first step toward understanding is always to examine the ordinary minutiae, the servants' habits, the clocks, the doors, the alignment of furniture, the smallest discrepancy in the routine. For it is in the ordinary that the extraordinary hides." He paused, glancing at the servants who had lingered quietly in the hall. "Do not speak yet. Observe, listen, watch. They will reveal themselves in gestures, in contradictions, in the tiniest hesitation. And when they do, my dear Miss Mordaunt, the map will have served its purpose, not as a guide to the estate, but as a guide to the mind of the intruder." A faint creak echoed from the corridor outside, almost imperceptible. Wimsey's eyes flicked toward the sound, a trace of dry amusement curling his lips. "Ah," he murmured, "and even silence has its accomplices. Let us see which among us is truly alone." With that, he moved to the door, ready to begin the first careful rounds of observation. His mind already piecing together a sequence of possibilities, each more intriguing than the last, each a tiny fracture in the polished surface of little Renly's civility. The game, he reflected, was only just beginning. Wimsey moved through the corridors of little Renly with a measured, almost theatrical patience, noting each subtle creak of the floorboards, each faint shift in the morning light that fell through the tall windows. The house seemed to him both a theater and a conspirator, holding its secrets just out of reach while inviting careful scrutiny. His gloved hand traced the edges of the door frames, noting tiny smudges of dust, the faintest impressions of fingertips, and the misalignment of the hallway clocks, all minutiae that would escape the casual observer but whispered volumes to him, sir. At the foot of the main staircase, he paused, eyes narrowing. "Notice, Miss Mordaunt," he said without turning, "how the hall clock is 3 minutes fast, while the one in the study is striking accurately. A trivial discrepancy, perhaps, yet it will prove illuminating. Timings, my dear, can lie as convincingly as any person, if only one knows where to listen." Miss Mordaunt's brow furrowed. "You mean the times recorded by the servants may be unreliable?" "Precisely. Not intentionally deceitful, merely influenced by assumption and habit. A watch that chimes late, a servant distracted, a drafty corridor, all are instruments in the orchestration of alibis. The devil, as they say, is in the details." He moved into the drawing room, where the morning sun made the polished surfaces glimmer. On the mantelpiece rested a small, ornate clock, its hands frozen at 10:52. Wimsey crouched, tilting his head. Ah, here we have a frozen witness, a clock intentionally stopped, or one simply abandoned to neglect. The manner of its arrest may indicate the urgency or hesitation of its last handler. He lifted the clock gently, examining the mechanism, then placed it back with precise care. Yes, Miss Mordaunt, you see now why we began with trifles, misaligned clocks, ink smears, fingerprints, and minor furniture displacements. Each is a syllable in the language of a crime. Individually, insignificant. Collectively, a statement. The faint sound of footsteps reached his ears, deliberate and unhurried. He glanced toward the hallway, but no one appeared. "The house moves, even when empty," he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. Or so one is made to believe. Observation, Miss Mordaunt, is not merely seeing, it is interpreting the unspoken narrative of motion and pause, absence and presence. He returned to the study, where the map still lay, its ink now seeming almost theatrical under the soft morning light. Wimsey tapped it lightly. The river, as you will recall, flows incorrectly, but notice the alignment of the surrounding landmarks, all accurate except for one. That deviation is deliberate, a subtle redirection, a hint to those who are not observant, or perhaps a message to those who are. Miss Mordaunt leaned forward. A message? From whom? Wimsey did not answer immediately. He moved to the window, gazing out at the garden where the hedges cast rigid, intricate shadows across the gravel paths. From someone who understood your uncle's habits, his reliance on precision, his expectation of routine. To manipulate him, or perhaps to mislead an observer, one must first understand the predictability of the victim. He turned back to the room, eyes sweeping the scattered papers and letters. "And this," he said, gesturing to the notebook filled with precise dates and initials, "may help us trace the movements of those within the house last night. If we correlate the entries here with the smudges, the fingerprints, the letters, and the clocks, we shall begin to see a sequence emerge. Not random, but carefully orchestrated." A faint, almost imperceptible draft stirred the curtains. Wimsey's gaze followed it to a narrow crack in the window frame. "Notice, Miss Mordaunt, even the draft has its voice. Windows left ajar, doors closed too tightly, carpets slightly displaced. All of these become clues when one is willing to read them." He moved toward the door, his expression arch yet composed. "The next step is simple yet delicate. Interviews, observations, and careful cross-referencing of times, movements, and statements. We must reconstruct the unseen choreography of last night, and in doing so, we shall discover discrepancies, contradictions, and, ultimately, the thread that binds intention to action." Miss Mordaunt remained silent, a mixture of anticipation and unease settling over her. Wimsey, standing amid the quiet authority of the study, allowed himself a faint smirk. The first subtle truths had been glimpsed, and now the house itself seemed to lean in, as if to whisper its secrets. The game was gathering depth, complexity, and the faintest thrill of inevitability. Wimsey spent the better part of the afternoon quietly observing the household in its apparently ordinary routines. The servants moved with the practiced efficiency of those who have learned that nothing should disturb the polished surface of a country estate. Yet each slight gesture, each flicker of hesitation, was catalogued in his mind with meticulous care. He noted how Mrs. Galloway paused an extra heartbeat before answering Thomas's whispered remarks, how Thomas's eyes darted toward the study whenever the clock chimed, and how the maid in the corner adjusted a vase ever so slightly, as though erasing an imperfection or a trace. Returning once more to the study, Wimsey inspected the notebook and letters again, following the sequence of initials and dates with patient fingers. "Here," he murmured, "we have the first glimpse of a pattern. The entries are methodical, almost obsessive. Whoever made them wished to ensure a precise record, but not one intended for anyone else. Personal, private and, therefore, dangerous in the wrong hands. Miss Mordaunt hovered near the desk, wringing her hands nervously. "Do you mean someone within the house might have read it, Lord Peter?" "Possibly," he replied, eyes narrowing as they traced a faint indentation in the page beneath the latest writing. "Or someone with access who wished to manipulate its contents. Observe these impressions, 1, 2, 3, deliberate, almost as if a code were being left for the observant eye." He leaned back, allowing a faint smile to touch his lips. "It is a curious paradox. The more hidden the message, the louder it speaks to those who know how to listen." He stood, moving to the window once again, where the late afternoon sun slanted across the garden. "And we must not ignore the spatial element. Consider the alignment of paths, the position of doors, the proximity of windows. Any visitor, any intruder, would leave subtle signs. Impressions in gravel, displaced foliage, a lock turned slightly differently than usual." Miss Mordaunt shivered. "Do you think someone came in during the night, Lord Peter?" "I do not merely think, my dear," he replied, his tone quietly amused. "I know it is a probability requiring careful analysis. A house as orderly as this offers no obvious entry for a stranger without knowledge of its routines. Yet the disturbance in the study, the altered map, the smudged ink, all point to an intruder, or at the very least, an orchestrated interference. And therein lies the challenge, to determine whether the manipulator was friend, foe, or simply opportunist." He moved back to the desk, tapping the map lightly. "The error in the river's course is a small, deliberate misdirection, but observe the surrounding markings. They remain precise. The hand that introduced error is skilled, not careless. It wishes to distract, to occupy attention, while another action, less visible, more consequential, takes place elsewhere. This is a game of distraction, my dear, played with elegance and cunning." Miss Mordaunt's voice was barely audible. "And you think someone within the house did this?" "Either within," said Wimsey, voice measured, "or someone who knows it intimately. A visitor would leave traces, noise, disturbance, or the faintest irregularity in routine. Yet Thomas and Mrs. Galloway noticed nothing, save for what might be explained away. That in itself is telling. People rarely notice what they expect not to see." He picked up the letter again, fingering it carefully. "And this letter, note the tone, the insistence upon discretion, the careful civility. It was composed by someone who understood both the victim and the likely observer. Anxiety masquerades as etiquette, desire for control masked as courtesy. One must read the subtext, my dear Miss Mordaunt, for therein lies the true meaning." A sudden sound, a chair scraping lightly in the corridor, caused Wimsey to glance sharply toward the doorway. His eyes, keen as any hawk's, detected nothing, yet he smiled faintly. Even in silence there are voices. Even in stillness motion speaks. We must be alert to the unnoticed. The house itself is a witness if one knows how to question it. He returned the letter to the desk, then straightened, hands clasped behind his back. "Our next task is to reconstruct the timeline with precision, to reconcile observations with statements, movements with opportunity. Only when the ordinary is examined with extraordinary care can the hidden narrative reveal itself, and I have every expectation that it shall do so, my dear, in the most illuminating fashion." Miss Mordaunt nodded, though uncertainty lingered in her expression. Wimsey's mind, meanwhile, was already racing, cataloguing discrepancies, testing alibis, and considering possibilities. Each faint sound, each trivial misalignment, each smudge of ink was a note in a complex symphony, a symphony he intended to play to its final, logical conclusion. As the evening descended upon Little Wrenley, the estate assumed a different character, its civility tinged with shadows and muted creaks. Wimsey moved silently through the hallways, observing the servants as they carried out their final duties of the day. Each movement, Each glance, each carefully measured step became, in his mind, part of an intricate choreography. Nothing escaped him. The slight tension in Mrs. Galloway's shoulders, the nervous tapping of Thomas's foot, the way the maid lingered too long at the foot of the stairs. He returned to the study, where the map lay still under the glow of the lamp, its smudges now appearing almost deliberate in their chaos. He crouched again, fingertips hovering above the blotches. A hurried hand, yes, but deliberate, he murmured. The smears suggest haste and concealment, yet with a purpose. One does not smudge ink in this precise manner without intention, either to mislead or to impress upon the observer a subtle message. Miss Mordaunt's voice was soft behind him. A message, but from whom? Wimsey straightened, arching an eyebrow. From someone who understood your uncle intimately. Observe the letter once more. Civility under pressure, insistence veiled as etiquette, repetition with subtle emphasis, all hallmarks of a mind attempting control while maintaining an illusion of politeness. Anxiety disguised as propriety. One might call it psychological craftsmanship. He moved toward the fireplace, lifting the letter with care. And here we see the first cracks in the facade. The letter, ostensibly ordinary, reveals a duality, courtesy and command, intention and restraint. Who could wield such subtlety? Who within or near this house possesses both knowledge of your uncle's habits and the capacity for deception? A faint sound from the corridor caused him to glance sharply toward the door, though again no one appeared. Even silence can be a clue, he said softly. The absence of expected footsteps, the lack of response to distant sounds, these too are evidence. It is not only what occurs that matters, but what fails to occur. Discrepancy is the ally of the observant. He returned to the map, tracing the errant river with a gloved finger. Notice how all surrounding features remain true except for this single deviation. It is a deliberate misdirection. Attention is drawn here while elsewhere. The critical act occurs. The skill lies not in the error itself, but in the orchestration of perception. Miss Mordaunt shivered. And you think this orchestration was aimed at my uncle? Precisely, Wimsey replied. But it is not merely a matter of intimidation or theft. The hand that interfered with the map is clever, anticipatory, aware of scrutiny. The manipulation is subtle because the perpetrator intends to remain unseen, yet observed. He moved to the notebook on the desk, flipping to the page of dates and initials once more. These entries, he said, pointing, may seem innocuous, but they chart movement, opportunity, and knowledge. When cross-referenced with times, locations, and minor disturbances, the smudges, the altered river, the letters, we begin to reconstruct not just where someone was, but what they intended. The ordinary minutiae are the skeleton of the extraordinary act. A clock chimed in the hall, its resonance uneven. Wimsey's eyes flicked toward it. Ah, another discrepancy. The hall clock is not synchronized with the study. Trivial, perhaps, but meaningful when one is attempting to validate alibis, track movement, and observe human behavior in minute detail. He straightened, eyes scanning the study with quiet satisfaction. The first wave of observation yields subtle contradictions, a few carefully concealed truths, and a host of minor anomalies. With these, we shall begin the process of elimination, pattern recognition, and psychological deduction. We shall test statements against time, gestures against habit, and the ordinary against the extraordinary. Miss Mordaunt, still tense, asked softly, "And you believe this will reveal the truth, Lord Peter?" Wimsey's expression was calm, almost amused. "In due course, my dear. The House has spoken, and we have begun to understand its language. The puzzle pieces are in place, the threads of movement observed, the first pattern emerging. Now we must wait, carefully, for the next detail, the subtle contradiction, the unnoticed gesture, the overlooked discrepancy, to complete the map of yesterday's actions. He moved toward the door, ready to begin the meticulous process of questioning and timing the household's next moves. Each observation, each subtle irregularity added weight to his silent investigation. The night deepened, and little Renly, polite and polished as ever, seemed almost to hold its breath, aware, perhaps, that its carefully maintained order was about to be quietly, inexorably unraveled. As twilight deepened into the muted grays of evening, Wimsey returned to the study for what he privately considered a crucial inspection. The house, quiet now save for the occasional creak of settling timbers or the distant shuffle of a cautious servant, seemed to him alive with unspoken testimony. He moved deliberately, eyes sweeping every surface, every shadow, every object left just slightly out of alignment. It was not enough to observe the overt disruption. One must discern the subtler currents beneath the ordinary. His attention was immediately drawn to the desk drawer he had examined before. A faint impression on the paper lining suggested a small object had been removed, or replaced, with great care. He fingered it lightly, noting the absence of weight where there should have been presence. "Curious," he murmured, almost to himself. "A deliberate removal, yet nothing seems missing of immediate value. The object may have been symbolic, a psychological marker, or perhaps a trigger for some later action." Miss Mordaunt, who had insisted on remaining nearby, stepped forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "Lord Peter, do you think it was my uncle's habit to leave such things out of place?" Wimsey shook his head slowly. "Your uncle was precise, orderly, and methodical. Any deviation from this pattern, no matter how slight, is a note in a clandestine language, intended either to mislead or to signal. And in this house, my dear, every signal carries weight." He moved to the map once more, tapping the misaligned river lightly with his gloved finger. "We must return to this. The alteration of the river is not merely a casual error. It is a diversion. And like all diversions, it has an intended audience. Someone who knows how your uncle thinks, how he observes, how he prioritizes detail. Yet notice the surrounding landmarks, precise, unaltered, seemingly trivial. These, I suspect, are intended to reinforce credibility, while the critical anomaly hides in plain sight. A faint sound, a drawer opening in another room, perhaps a servant fetching a late errand, caused him to glance sharply toward the hallway. He detected nothing overt, yet a subtle draft suggested that a window had been left slightly ajar, though its lock appeared unbroken. "Even inaction," he murmured, "speaks. A window left unsecured may be an error, or it may be intentional, designed to create uncertainty in the minds of those who observe." He returned to the notebook, flipping to the page of dates and initials. "Observe this," he said, pointing to a cluster of notations. "To the casual eye, mere accounting. But in conjunction with the disrupted map, the smudged ink, and the misaligned clocks, we begin to see a structure. It is a subtle choreography of movement and misdirection. Whoever acted last night had both knowledge and foresight." Miss Mordaunt shivered, clasping her hands nervously. "And you think this person is someone in the house?" "Most likely," Wimsey replied, his tone calm, yet carrying that slight archness of amusement. "A visitor, without intimate knowledge, would have left more overt traces. A house such as this, watched and known, affords opportunity for subtlety, yet few possess the cunning to exploit it fully. We must therefore consider proximity, habit, and psychology in equal measure." He moved toward the fireplace, where the letter lay. "And the letter," he continued, "reveals not only intention, but temperament. Anxiety dressed as civility, insistence veiled in politeness. This is not the hand of a common thief. It is the hand of someone who wishes to control perception, manipulate outcome, and conceal intent beneath a veneer of propriety. Observe how carefully each phrase is constructed. Even the underlining is measured, deliberate. He replaced the letter and stood still, surveying the study as a general might survey a battlefield. "We are dealing, my dear Miss Mordaunt, not with a violent explosion of passion, but with the quiet, careful orchestration of influence. The sequence of last night's events was constructed to appear trivial, even accidental, yet each detail, each clock, each smudge, each small discrepancy, is a deliberate note in the symphony of deception." A low murmur of the wind through the slightly ajar window stirred the papers on the desk. Wimsey's eyes followed their movement, noting a sheet that had shifted just enough to reveal a previously hidden annotation. A date, a time, a barely legible initial. His smile was faint, arch, and entirely private. "Ah," he murmured. "Here is the first piece of confirmation. A detail dismissed earlier, now appearing of critical relevance. The past speaks to the attentive observer, and little Renly, in its polite silence, whispers the truth in fragments to those willing to listen." He turned toward the door, preparing to move through the house once more, following the faint echoes and subtle irregularities. Each step, each observation, each carefully noted discrepancy would bring him closer to the pattern, to the choreography of last night's events. The game, intricate and invisible to all but the most meticulous eye, was reaching a stage where intuition and observation would converge, and the first threads of revelation would begin to untangle themselves. By the late evening, a heavy stillness had settled over little Renly, broken only by the faint rustle of the night wind against the hedgerows and the occasional settling of the old house. Wimsey, moving with the quiet certainty of a man who perceives far more than he reveals, retraced the steps of the previous day in his mind, tracing the sequence of minor disturbances, overlooked gestures, and subtle contradictions that now composed a silent narrative. Each detail, the smudged map, the misaligned clocks, the ink blots, the shifted papers, had begun to assume significance, forming a lattice of evidence that only the patient eye could discern. He paused by the study window, looking down upon the dimly lit garden paths. "Notice, Miss Mordaunt," he said softly, "the geometry of movement. The gravel paths, narrow and winding, leave impressions only under certain conditions. One could traverse them quietly if one knew their way. But the question remains, who did, and for what purpose?" She shivered, but did not speak. Wimsey turned, scanning the room, now familiar in its minute irregularities. "We must consider opportunity and knowledge together. Any visitor, unfamiliar with the house, would leave more obvious traces, but someone intimate with these corridors, with these habits, can orchestrate events such that disruption appears accidental while observation remains intact." He approached the map again, tapping lightly on the smeared river. "I've been returning to this, and for good reason. The misalignment is not merely geographical. It is psychological. The hand that altered it wishes attention drawn away from some other act, some other crucial manipulation." Wimsey then bent over the notebook once more, following the series of initials and dates. "Consider the pattern here," he murmured. "It is not chaotic. It is deliberate. The entries correspond to times, to minor movements, to events that seem trivial but, when aligned with the smudges, the altered map, and the letters, suggest a carefully plotted series of actions. The intruder, or orchestrator, planned this with foresight, fully aware of observation and expectation. A soft noise, the faintest scrape of furniture in the hallway, caused him to glance sharply. Nothing visible stirred. He allowed himself the faintest smile. "Even absence can speak," he murmured. "Silence, like a witness, tells the story when one knows how to read it." He returned to the fireplace, lifting the letter again with care. "And this," he said, voice low and measured, "remains the key to understanding intention. Anxiety hidden beneath civility, repetition underlined, phrasing precise. It is the mark of someone accustomed to command, yet careful to disguise authority. Someone who understood your uncle, his habits, and, I suspect, his routines. Miss Mordaunt's voice was barely audible. Do you think that person could be close to the family? Close enough to move unseen, yet not so close as to risk detection, he replied, his eyes narrowing thoughtfully. Proximity matters. Yes, but knowledge of habits, timing, and psychology is far more valuable. And we have already observed subtle indicators of both in the movements of those who live here. He turned toward the desk, examining the smudged map once more. And notice the river, a diversion, subtle yet intentional. Attention is drawn here, while the true action occurred elsewhere, unnoticed. The skill is in manipulation, not in the act itself. Whoever did this wishes to obscure intention with trivial distraction. He paused, scanning the scattered papers, the notebook, the letters, the subtle misalignments of the room. So much depends upon minor details. Clocks a few minutes fast or slow, windows left slightly ajar, furniture nudged, letters moved, footsteps faintly misaligned with expected patterns. And yet these details, when correlated, reveal the truth more decisively than any confession. His eyes rested briefly on the window frame, where the faintest draft suggested a slight shift. An intruder, a careful hand, knowledge of the house, a manipulation of perception, and a trail of trifles left to guide or mislead the observer. All of these converge toward a pattern, and patterns, Miss Mordaunt, cannot lie. He stood back, clasping his gloved hands behind him, his expression one of mild, private amusement. The first threads of deception are unraveling. The overlooked detail, once dismissed, has assumed significance. The ordinary, once examined with extraordinary care, has begun to yield its secrets. And when the final sequence is assembled, the invisible choreography of last night will reveal the architect behind it all. The house, polished and polite, seemed to shiver imperceptibly under the weight of observation. Wimsey, calm, arch, and quietly triumphant, allowed himself a faint smile. The first true pieces of the puzzle were in place, and now, with patience and precise reasoning, he would begin to trace the path that would lead inevitably to revelation. By the late hours, the quiet of Little Wrenley had deepened into an almost tangible stillness. Even the night wind, which had whispered intermittently through the hedgerows, seemed to pause in deference to the hushed drama unfolding within the walls. Wimsey moved with the deliberate patience of a man about to perform an intricate proof, retracing observations, cross-referencing timings, and aligning the trifles of the evening into a coherent pattern. Each shadow, each faint noise, each barely perceptible irregularity in the house's daily rhythm had been noted, filed, and compared with previous accounts. He returned to the study once more, where the map lay under the glow of a single lamp, smudges and ink blots appearing almost theatrical under the flickering light. Wimsey crouched, tracing the deviation in the river with a gloved fingertip. "Attention directed here," he murmured, while the true act, subtle, calculated, almost invisible, occurred elsewhere. And yet, even the most careful deception leaves a trace for the patient observer. Miss Mordaunt hovered at the edge of the room, her nervous hands clasped. "Lord Peter, do you truly believe the pattern can be reconstructed?" Wimsey straightened, eyes keen and calm. "Indeed, my dear, the house has spoken in whispers and omissions, in slight movements and minor inconsistencies. Each detail is a syllable in the narrative. It is now a matter of reading them in sequence, of tracing the invisible hand that manipulated both space and time within these walls." He moved to the notebook once again, his finger following the series of initials and dates. Observe this sequence. To the casual eye, mere accounting, but when correlated with the altered map, the ink smears, the misaligned clocks, the letters, and the minor disruptions noted by the servants, we begin to see a choreography, a deliberately orchestrated series of actions designed to appear incidental while concealing intent. The architect of this evening was precise, deliberate, and, I suspect, intimately familiar with your uncle's habits." A faint creak came from the corridor, a subtle reminder that the house, though still, was never truly empty. Wimsey's eyes flicked toward the sound, but detected no intruder. "Even absence," he murmured, "speaks. Discrepancies in expected sounds, the lack of response where one should occur. These are the footprints of intention." He returned to the fireplace, where the letter lay. "And the letter," he continued, "remains the key to understanding motive and temperament. Anxiety veiled in courtesy, repetition underlined, phrasing meticulous. Not the hand of a common thief, but of someone capable of manipulation, aware of observation, and accustomed to discretion. The true puzzle lies not in what is visible, but in what is deliberately obscured." Miss Mordaunt's voice trembled slightly. "So, someone close to the house, someone who knew my uncle well." "Close enough to observe and manipulate without detection," Wimsey said, tone arch yet calm. "Knowledge is far more valuable than proximity when it comes to subtle orchestration. And already we have evidence of both: careful interference, minor misalignments, precise timing, and psychological nuance." He moved once more to the desk, inspecting the smudged map, the notebook, and the letters in unison. Each minor irregularity, clocks a few minutes off, ink smudges, papers shifted, faint impressions of fingers, windows left ajar, functions as a note in a symphony of deception. And when the sequence is assembled, the hidden hand becomes apparent. The ordinary, once carefully observed, reveals the extraordinary. He paused, letting the silence settle around them, heavy with anticipation. "Tonight," he said softly, "we have gathered the necessary threads: observation, contradiction, timing, and the faintest whispers of motive. The house has guided us toward understanding, and tomorrow, when the ordinary routines resume, the hidden choreography of last night will be revealed in full. The architect, unmasked not by brute force but by patience, perception, and subtle reasoning, will find their intricate plan undone by the very details they believed trivial." Wimsey allowed himself the faintest private smile. The first layers of deception had been peeled back. The path to revelation was now clear, and the final act of quiet, relentless deduction was poised to begin. Dawn broke over Little Wrenley with a muted grey light, the mist curling across the garden paths like a reluctant spectator. Wimsey was already awake, moving quietly through the house, attuned to the subtle rhythms and hidden sounds of a home that had, until now, appeared polite and predictable. He paused at the study door, listening to the faint rustle of sheets and the soft shuffle of feet in the adjacent rooms. Each movement, each hesitated step, each unnoticed glance of the servants would, he knew, become part of the puzzle's resolution. He entered the study with deliberate calm, surveying the desk, the map, the letters, and the notebook as though greeting old friends. "Everything remains in place," he murmured, "yet nothing is truly ordinary. And it is within these trifles that the truth has been whispering all along." Miss Mordaunt, pale and still somewhat nervous, followed him quietly. "Lord Peter, do you think we will finally understand what happened last night?" "Patience, my dear," he said, voice arch yet measured. "The hour for observation is past. The hour for deduction is upon us. What remains is to reconstruct the choreography, to align evidence with opportunity, and to expose the hand behind the misdirection. The trivial details, the smudged ink, the altered map, the misaligned clocks, the letters, the faint impressions in the dust, have all been preserved for our scrutiny." He moved to the fireplace, tapping the letter lightly. "Observe the tone, the repetition, the measured civility of language, anxiety veiled in politeness, insistence disguised as courtesy. This is no impulsive act, no hurried crime. It is the calculated manipulation of perception intended to obscure intention while guiding attention elsewhere." Wimsey's eyes swept the room, noting every misalignment, every subtle clue previously catalogued. The slight tilt of a chair, the barely discernible indentation on the desk blotter, the draft from a window left slightly ajar. Opportunity, knowledge, and psychology, he murmured. When combined, they form a framework invisible to the casual observer, but undeniable to the attentive mind. He turned toward Miss Mordaunt, his gaze calm but penetrating. Now, we shall follow the evidence, step by step, and observe where each path converges. The smudged ink suggests a left-handed hand attempting disguise. The altered river on the map, a subtle misdirection. The clocks, each slightly off, provide windows of uncertainty. And the notebook reveals movements and timings meticulously noted, yet with hidden implications. Each piece alone is trivial. Together, they reveal the architecture of last night's events. He picked up the map, tracing the misaligned river with a gloved finger. Attention drawn here, while the decisive act, quiet, unobserved, and psychologically subtle, occurred elsewhere. The perpetrator relies upon our expectation of routine, our assumptions about the house's civility. But we have observed beyond routine, beyond expectation, and now we shall see the structure of intention laid bare. A faint creak from the corridor reminded him that even silence had its accomplices. The house itself provides testimony, he said softly, if one knows how to question it. Doors, floors, windows, shadows, and silences, these too speak of movement, presence, and intent. He returned the map to the desk, turning to the notebook and letters with calm precision. The final act is to align these observations with human behavior, the hesitation of servants, the unconscious gestures, the discrepancies in statements and timing. The architect of the disruption cannot fully control the house, nor the minds of those who observe. Human nature leaves a trail, often faint, yet consistent, and it is along this trail that we shall trace our culprit. Miss Mordaunt, still tense, ventured softly. "And you know who it is?" Wimsey allowed a faint, private smile. "I know who has left the orchestration in place, and I know how it will unravel. But the delight, my dear, is in witnessing the sequence, in allowing observation and deduction to converge. When the final alignment occurs, the truth will be as inescapable as a shadow in sunlight, and the architect's deception, however elegant, shall be exposed in its entirety." He stepped back, hands clasped behind him, eyes scanning the study as though it were a theater stage awaiting its final act. The ordinary and the extraordinary had been carefully catalogued, the hidden choreography of last night meticulously observed, and now the moment for revelation was at hand. Little Renly, polite, ordered, and outwardly calm, seemed to lean forward as though anticipating the unmasking of the invisible hand that had orchestrated so much with such subtlety. And Wimsey, calm, arch, and quietly triumphant, allowed himself a faint, knowing smile. The household was assembled in the drawing room shortly after breakfast, each member of the family and staff arranged in the polite rigidity of those summoned to a formal occasion. The air was heavy with expectation and unspoken anxiety, though outwardly everyone maintained the veneer of civility. Wimsey, standing near the mantelpiece, allowed a faint, arch smile to touch his lips as he surveyed them all, noting the subtle signs of tension. Mrs. Galloway's tightened fingers, Thomas's restless foot tapping, Miss Mordaunt's pale, attentive posture, and even the faintly defiant tilt of the vicar's head. "Good morning," he began, voice calm, dry and measured. "I trust you have all had your breakfast, though I suspect none of you have yet digested the events of yesterday, or indeed the lessons they carry." His gaze swept the room, pausing ever so slightly on each face. It is often in the ordinary that the extraordinary hides, and in the routine that deception finds sanctuary. Let us examine both with care. He stepped closer to the study desk, where the map lay once more, and picked it up delicately. displaying the smudged river for all to see. "Observe here," he said, tapping the ink blot lightly. A diversion. Attention drawn to a trivial misalignment while the true act, the subtle orchestration of opportunity and timing, occurred elsewhere. Someone knew your uncle intimately. Knew the habits, the expectations, and the routines. And someone relied upon this knowledge to manipulate events with the utmost discretion. Miss Mordaunt's voice was barely above a whisper. "You mean it was someone we know?" "Indeed," Wimsey replied, arch but firm. "Not a stranger, but someone whose presence is familiar, whose knowledge of the household allowed them to move unseen, unnoticed, and undetected. And yet, despite their precautions, they left a trail, traces in time, in movement, and in human behavior, that now allow us to reconstruct the sequence of events." He moved to the notebook, flipping to the page of initials and dates, aligning it with the letters and the altered map. The entries, though appearing innocuous, chart opportunity and presence. Cross-referenced with discrepancies in clocks, subtle disturbances of furniture, and the small irregularities in behavior noted yesterday, the pattern emerges with the clarity of sunlight upon a shadow. Each trivial detail, preserved and examined, has guided us to the architect of the deception. He paused, letting his eyes rest upon the assembled group. The manipulation was elegant, precise, and psychological rather than physical. Anxiety hidden beneath civility, insistence disguised as courtesy, movements carefully orchestrated, all intended to obscure intent while guiding attention elsewhere. But human nature is not so easily contained. Gestures betray, inconsistencies accumulate, and timing reveals the truth. Finally, he stepped forward, his voice lowering slightly. "The person responsible is—" He allowed the pause to hang, each heart in the room quickening. Someone who moved with apparent innocence, who relied upon the house's routine and the expectation of civility to conceal their orchestration. They were careful, yes, clever even, but not beyond the reach of observation, deduction, and patient analysis. The truth has been whispered in the details all along, and now the pattern is complete. Eyes widened across the room as realization began to dawn. Miss Mordaunt gasped softly, Thomas shifted uneasily, and Mrs. Galloway's hands tightened. Wimsey's arch smile remained, calm yet triumphant. The smudges, the misaligned clocks, the altered map, the letters, and the faintest impressions in dust, all have conspired to tell a story. And that story leads inexorably to the individual before us, whose intentions, however carefully disguised, are now unmistakable. He allowed a brief, delicate pause for the weight of his words to settle, then continued, each sentence precise, unhurried, and quietly devastating. The orchestration was psychological, the manipulation subtle, and yet the evidence, small, ordinary, and overlooked, reveals them entirely. We have only to trace the sequence, observe the contradictions in behavior, and the carefully concealed movements. There is nowhere left to hide. A low, almost incredulous murmur rippled through the room. The culprit, realizing the inevitability of exposure, faltered for a moment, caught between defiance and recognition. Wimsey, eyes calm, voice measured yet carrying the faintest hint of triumph, stepped closer. "And so," he said softly, "the game is complete. The threads are untangled, and the architect of last night's subtle manipulation stands revealed. The house, the objects, the behaviors, and the chronology all speak the same truth. There is no further concealment possible." The culprit's composure wavered, a faint flush rising, hands trembling imperceptibly. Wimsey's smile deepened ever so slightly, arch and knowing. The ordinary minutiae, he concluded, have illuminated the extraordinary plan. And now, as the truth stands fully before us, we see that subtlety, no matter how artfully wielded, is never beyond the reach of careful observation and reasoned deduction. A hush fell over the room. The house, polite and orderly, seemed to exhale as though satisfied that its silent testimony had finally been heard, and its carefully concealed narrative, for all its elegance, had been revealed by the sharp intellect and quiet patience of Lord Peter Wimsey.